Share the screen. Okay, so the issue that got us into trouble last week was verse. Well, it also trips up the sages. They want to know what's happening here, and the classic commentators. Verse 28 in chapter 37. So what happens is the brothers, they put Joseph into the pit, and then they sit down for lunch, and they realize that they see merchants coming by, Ishmaelites, and they realize that the Jew is always looking for a profit. There's no profit here. If the brother is killed and dies in the pit, there's no money to be made. So they say, what kind of money can we make? So they say, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. That's verse 27. But our hand shall not be upon him, for he is our brother, our flesh, and his brothers hearkened. That was Judah's idea. So that's, he wants to sell him to the Ishmaelites. Then you get to verse 28. What does verse 28 say? Verse 28 is a little bit confusing. Then Midianite men, merchants, passed by, and they pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 silver pieces, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. The question is, who brought Joseph to where? Is it the Ishmaelites or the Midianites? It's a little bit confusing, right? Because, let me just see the end of the chapter. Yeah, and then in verse 37 is again a problem. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt, the end of this chapter. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chamberlain, chief of the slaughterers. So how did the Midianites get involved? And if you look at verse 27, Judah says, let's send him to the Ishmaelites. Verse 25, they saw caravan of Ishmaelites. And then all of a sudden, 28, Midianite men arrive. So, and they pulled Joseph, lifted Joseph from the pit. So there's a little bit of a problem. So Rashi, we mentioned this last week. Rashi says that as follows. Rashi says that in verse 28, when it says Midianite men, merchants pass by, Rashi says 28 is a different caravan than verse 25. Right? We're talking about they're sitting at the route where people are traveling from Israel to Egypt or from Mesopotamia to Egypt. And so this caravans all the time, all day long, there are caravans, like the train is passing. So they lift up their eyes, they see Ishmaelites passing. Then, that's verse 25, then they make the plan. But when in reality, they sold him to, in verse 28, now they see these other people, there's Midianite people passing. So Rashi says it's a different caravan. And then it says, the Torah lets you know that he was sold multiple times. Rashi continues, Vayim Shechu, they drew, verse 28. They drew, verse 28. How does it translate it here? And they don't have the they. This article is not going to help me here. Verse 28, it says, and they pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit. Who's the they? Rashi says it's the brothers, the children of Jacob. Pulled up Joseph, sold him to the Ishmaelites. Right? Even at 28, it says they sold him to the Ishmaelites. And then, like I said, in verse 36, it says Midianites sold him to Potiphar. So what's going on? So that's what Rashi's point is. Rashi says, well, he was sold multiple times. There's multiple caravans. Everybody's flipping Joseph and making a profit on the thing. That's what we said last week. That was Rashi. Then we said in Ramban, Nachmanides quotes Rashi, and he says, you don't really have to get that complicated. You don't have to say it was sold multiple times. What you simply could say is that there's a caravan, and the caravan is the transportation business. But what are they transporting? Who are they transporting? They're transporting Midianite people who are merchants. That's what verse 28 says. Verse 28 says that the Midianite men traders passed by. Okay. Verse 25, it just said a caravan of Ishmaelites. Doesn't say what they did. They were not merchants. They weren't traders. They were in the transportation business. So the Ishmaelites are transporting the Midianites, the Midianite people, the traders, and their merchandise. And then the brothers don't understand the subtlety. They don't realize that the Ishmaelites are not in the trade business, in the slave business. They're in the transportation business. So the brothers want to sell to the Ishmaelites. And Nachmanides says, why do they want to sell to the Ishmaelites? This is also going to be a little bit of praise for the brothers, because the brothers, the Ishmaelites, their cousin. Ishmael's their cousin. They figure maybe they'll be nice to him. So that's what the verse is highlighting, that the brothers had a good intention. The reality is the Ishmaelites are not in the trade business, so they don't sell them to the Ishmaelites. They send them to the Midianites. That's what Nachmanides says. It's just one caravan, right? So far, so good. We have two interpretations. One is multiple caravans selling to each other, and then ultimately to Egypt. Nachmanides says no, it's one caravan. The Ishmaelites, the Ishmaelites have the whatever they did, camels. They have the means of transportation, and they're transporting Midianites with their merchandise. Okay. Then we said last week, and I remembered, I didn't remember where it said it, but I said by just reading it, I said 1 second. It doesn't necessarily say that the brothers sold Joseph. In fact, the implication from verse 28 is the brothers did not sell Joseph. If you look at verse 38, then Midianite men, merchants, passed by, and they pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit. Who's the they? Right. So who's the subject of the sentence? So Midianite men is the subject of the sentence. So when it says and they, you would assume that it's the Midianites that pull Joseph out of the pit. If you just read verse 28, if you know no other evidence in the story, if you go to a trial and you're a defense attorney and you show the jury knows nothing other than 28, other than 28. And you say, convict Joseph's brothers for the sale of Joseph. You know what they're going to say? The jury, there's no evidence here. Verse 28 doesn't say the brothers did it. It says the Midianites did it. Now, there are other verses that implies that the brothers did sell Joseph. Which other verse? Not that many verses.
In the end of Genesis, there is.
In the end of Genesis, where Joseph says, I am your brother who you sold to Egypt. And they don't argue with him. How are you going to argue with the king? But the narrator doesn't say anything.
But don't the brothers at some point say that they sold Joseph? Later on in Genesis.
Later on in Genesis, they say, we're guilty because we saw our brother's pain when he cried to us and we didn't answer. That could be talked about putting him in the pit.
I'd have to look to Genesis.
You have to look to Genesis. So, but I trust the commentator. Oh, so that's what I said last week. And then Michael told us that that's exactly how Dennis Prager reads the Torah. And then he said that Dennis Prager said he read it by himself. He reached that conclusion. And I said, I don't know. He went to yeshiva. He must have heard it somewhere. Indeed, the Rashbam. Rashbam is an interesting fellow. Shmuel Bar Meir, he's Rashi's grandson. And he has a commentary on the Torah. And he a lot of times argues with his grandfather. How could he argue with his grandfather? He did. And then he has, actually, I think is it in this parsha? Could be it's even in this parsha somewhere. I have to go check exactly. He says, I was debating with my grandfather about the pshat, about the simple meaning. And he says, my grandfather admitted to me that if he had time, he would go again and write another commentator, because even the pshat, the simple meaning of the Bible, there's pshat that is renewed every day. In other words, you want to do pshat, you want to do straightforward meaning, but the straightforward meaning is also dynamic. That's what he quotes. That's what the Rashbam testifies that his grandfather told him. The Rashbam says, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, brothers didn't sell Joseph. It was the Ishmaelites. In other words, the brothers say, oh, we have a great idea. Let's sell our brother. But the people beat him to it. The Midianites see a person in the pit. They say, oh, what a profit. We can sell him as a slave and we'll get the profit. So what about the one verse? There's only one verse in Exodus, in Genesis, in the Torah, according to Rashbam. I'm sure he checked it, even though he didn't have a computer or Google, but I'm sure he was better than Google. I don't know, faster, but better certainly. And
Control F.
yes, Control F, but Control F, yeah, but if you have it on the thing, yeah, you have to have the whole Bible on this thing. But in any case, so the Rashbam says there's only one verse, that Joseph tells the brother, I am your brother who you sold to Egypt. Rashbam says that's not the biggest question. You could say, I am your brother who you caused me to be sold to Egypt. Right? I mean, they started they started the process. That is the Rashbam's interpretation. We touched upon it last week. So I wanted to say that this is the Rashbam's interpretation, and here you have it. Okay, so the question like this is, does it really matter? Does it really matter who sold them? The Ishmaelites, the Midianites? What does it really matter? So Ramban, Nachmanides, who basically says the Ishmaelites were in the transportation business and the Midianites were the merchants, and he sold them to the merchants. The brothers wanted to sell to the Ishmaelites. In reality, it was sold to the Midianites. So the Ramban, according to Ramban's interpretation, we understand why it's important. It's also sort of defending the brothers. I think they wouldn't consider selling him to anyone other than their family. So it's sort of a quote unquote defense. That's what Nachmanides says. As otherwise, what do I care? Midianites, Ishmaelites. What's the meaning? So that was what we had last week. So I reached out to my brothers-in-law. We have a little chat where we put up questions and comments on the verses. And I said, one of my brothers-in-law is an attorney. I said, I'm showing you verse 28. And I said, prove to me that that the brothers sold Joseph. You can't prove it to me. You won't convince me from verse 28. You're not going to do it. They try, and they can't get it. They can't prove it to me. So that sparked the conversation. So my brother-in-law pulls out an email. You can see it right here. In 2016, I sent to them, and I said like this: Moshe comes from Midian to Egypt to redeem the Jews. Is there a connection to the fact that the exile begins through the sale of Joseph through the Midianites? So I said that was a good idea. I didn't remember saying it in 2016. It's a long time ago, but that sounds interesting. So maybe we're trying to say, who cares who sold Joseph? I don't know the answer, but I'm saying, right, what does it matter? It was the Midianites, the Ishmaelites. Why is it so important? But it's interesting that the Torah puts in Midianites, and the Midianites. So I don't know. I have to develop this idea. You have to help me develop this idea. But it seems like it becomes full circle that the beginning of the exile and the beginning of the redemption come from the same place. It's almost like full circle. So I don't know. Take it or leave it. I give you the kernel of the idea, and you could develop it. And if you develop it, you can get the credit for it. You don't have to give me the credit. Okay, fine. So that's for that. One more interesting interpretation I saw. It's very subtle, but you have to look. But I'll share the screen because it's subtle, and we'll. At the end of the chapter, verse 37, and the Midianites sold him to Egypt. Right? It reiterates, the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chamberlain, chief of the slaughterers. In the Torah, I always talk about this, I don't always talk about it, but I mention it, that in the Torah, there is some inconsistency in the way you write words. In biblical Hebrew is what they call malea chaser. There are certain words that you can write what they call full or empty. So, for example, the letter Yud, things could be spelled with a Yud or without a Yud, or with a Vav or without a Vav. And it's just not a good way to do a scientific language. So in modern Hebrew, when you go to the store and you buy a dictionary, the dictionary is going to say, in this dictionary, we write all our words either full or empty. It has to be consistent. Now, I don't remember in modern Hebrew which one is more prevalent. I don't know. But in any case, you have to be consistent. I'm sorry, full is more thing. But I remember as a kid, I opened up the dictionary, the first page. They tell you here everything is full or empty. I don't remember. The Torah is all over the board. In the same chapter, you can have the same word with a yud, without a yud. And Rashi usually does not address that. That's the way you write it. Doesn't really matter. In other words, in level of pshat, simple level, you don't have to get caught up with how they wrote it with a yud, without a yud. Certainly according to the mystical interpretation, every word in the Torah is precise, so there's a reason. But Rashi doesn't make it his business to interpret each time a letter is written, a word is written with a vav and without a vav, even in the same chapter. He doesn't always do it. He does it a few times in the Torah. So he does do it a few times, but not always. So we understand that pshat, don't get too bothered. Here's case in point, the word Midyanim, the Midianites. So for example, if you look at the first time it appears in verse 28, then Midianite men. So the third word of the verse, Chavchet, Vayavru Anashim Midyanim, 2 yuds, right? It's written full, 2 yuds, Midyanim. Go to the end of the chapter, verse 36. In the English, it's on stone, it's page 206. The last verse on page 206. Vehamid Midyanim. How many yuds? Only 1 yud. Not only 1 yud, actually the spelling is even a little bit different. Instead of midyanim, because there's no yud, they say v'hamidanim. It's actually I didn't realize this. It's actually pronounced different. V'hamidanim. Now midyanim. Okay, yud. It's the same people with a yud, without a yud. It's not such an important word. That's what you would think. But it could be, I saw a commentator that says like this. He says that maybe the Torah is alluding to something else other than Midianites. In biblical Hebrew, madon means fighting or quarreling. So this word could be read, this verse could be read, the quarreling caused him to be sold to Egypt. In other words, the quarreling between Joseph and his brothers. That's not pshat. That's not the simple reading. Simple reading is it's Midianites. But you see, the Torah here omits a yud, and when you omit the word or the yud, all of a sudden the verse could have additional meaning. By the way, this week's parsha is all about the Midianites, the battle. The Jewish people go to battle with the Midianites in this week's parsha. Is it this week's parsha or is it next week's parsha? I should know this. But it's Sunday, so what do I know on Sunday? No. No, it's next week's parsha. Battle against Midian, because the Midianites sent their daughters to entice the Jewish people to sin, etc. So Midianites, mystically speaking, the Midianites represents quarreling also. That's mystically speaking. But in any case, that yud here could be significant. So that's nice. Okay, fine. What happens now? We still have what to do on this page before we can get to the next chapter. We're going to show some Rashi's commentary to make it exciting. Okay, so the verse continues. We'll just do some of the drama. Chapter 29. Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he rent his garments. Right? We know that Reuven wanted to save the Joseph. He told his brothers, "Don't kill him, put him in the pit." And the Torah testifies that he did it in order to save him. But for whatever reason, he wasn't there when they sat down for lunch. Rashi says he was fasting. He didn't eat lunch with them. He comes back, he's gone. The kid is gone. Reuven tears his garments. He's in trouble. Why is he in trouble? He goes to his brothers, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where will I go?" In other words, Rashi says, "Where will I go? Where will I flee from my father's pain?" But other people say, no, he's the oldest, so he'll be held accountable, right? So that's why he's more worried than everybody else. His father would say, "You're the oldest. Why didn't you take care of your brother?" So he's worried. So they have to create a cover up. So they took Joseph's coat, they slaughtered a kid, and they dipped the coat in blood. And they sent the fine woolen coat, and they brought it to their father, and they said, "We have found this. Now recognize whether it is your son's coat or not." So just for a moment, the question is, did they actually bring it to the father, or was it somebody else? We discussed this last time. It could be that they actually sent it, but they didn't bring it, because they sent the fine woolen coat and they brought it to their father. So if they sent it, they didn't have to bring it. If they brought it, why do they have to send it? Sending and bringing is not the same thing. Bringing is they bring it by themselves. Sending is they cause it to be sent. Somebody else sends it. So you could say there's some sort of combination. They have it sent and they're there when it arrives. They don't want to bring the evidence. Oh, we found this because then it doesn't. Maybe it's not as convincing that it's not a conspiracy. In any case, they say haker na. Now recognize whether is it your son's coat or not. He recognized it, and he said, "It is my son's coat. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn up." Okay. This is a very interesting phrase. Haker na. Recognize, please. Or recognize now, but recognize, please. No, it's probably please. Why is this so interesting? So the Medrash makes a connection. And the Medrash says that there's only one other place in the Torah where the verse says these two words come together. Haker no, recognize, please. And the next other place it happens is the next chapter. So I'm giving you a little preview. So what happens in the next chapter? The story of Judah and Tamar. Long story short, very, very long story short. Tamar is his daughter, Judah's daughter-in-law's husband, two husbands, first and second husband dies. She has to marry the third son, Judah's third son. Judah doesn't want to give this third son to her. He's afraid this third son will die as well. So she tells her, "Oh, wait at home, and when my son grows up, you'll marry him." He had no intention of giving her his son. She realizes what's going on. He comes, Judah's wife dies. She conceals herself presents herself as a harlot, has relations with Judah, becomes pregnant. Judah says she has to be killed because she's officially still wed to the family. She's waiting for the son. And she's about to be killed. And she sends to Judah, this is the person who I had relations with. I have his signet, I have his stick, and I have his belt. And Haker now, recognize please if this is yours. But Haker now, recognize please if whose it is. She doesn't want to embarrass him in public. He says, yes, it was me. That's the only two places we have Haker now, where Judah, where the brothers send the garment to their father, and where Tamar sends the signet and the stick and the belt to Judah. So there has to be a connection. So one connection is that the Medrash makes this connection. The Medrash says the brothers, and Judah presumably is a leader. Judah tricks his father with Hakerna, and he is also tricked with Hakerna. Now it's not exactly the same because he wasn't tricked with Hakerna. Hakerna was the point. He was tricked before that. He was tricked. She presented herself as a harlot, but here is almost like she shows him, "Oh, I tricked you." So that's the conventional interpretation that basically measure for measure, what Judah does comes back to Judah. Fine. He tricks his father, he's tricked. I saw another commentator that says as follows. He says a very interesting thing. Hakerna, in Tamar and Judah's stories, when she says Hakerna, recognize please, is it whose these are? What she's really saying is, take responsibility. Recognize that it's you. The brothers may be telling their father. Now look at this verse 31. Maybe we can read this a little bit differently. The brothers may be telling the father, and they said, we have found this. Now recognize, haker now, recognize now, which we said in the context of Judah and Tamar means take responsibility, whether it is your son's coat or not. What does that mean? Could be, what is this your son's coat? Technical question. It could be it's much deeper than a technical question. Maybe what caused this sale of Joseph is the jealousy which started out with the garments, right? So in other words, they're coming to him and they feel guilty because they were overtaken by the hatred, which was motivated by the jealousy. But once they sold him, now they realized the mistake and they can't turn the wheel back. Now they're looking to shift the blame. So they go to the father and they say, are you responsible as well? Right? And they're not going to say it. They're going to say, is this your child's garment? If not, in other words, what's this? This means not this garment, that this story is this whole pain that's leading, this whole story culminating to this point. Is that because of your son's garment? They don't say Joseph, your son's garment. But that was the garment you brought your son. So that could be an interesting thing that Haker Naz, and really an invitation to recognize, think about the broader implications of the story, not just this technical item that we're bringing to you. And that's clearly what's happening with Judah and Tamar, where she says, recognize, take responsibility. This is you. She doesn't say it, but that's what she's saying. Haker, recognize. And maybe the brother's telling that to the father as well. Okay, fine. He recognizes it, and he said, it is my son's coat. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn up. Okay, yes.
You connect very well the story of Joseph and the story of Judah and Tamar, but you also need to connect, I think, the way Jacob deceived his father.
Yeah, the Medrash says the same thing. Where does Joseph deceive his father? When he wants to steal the blessings. What happens to steal the blessings? So he does a few things. One of the things he does is he takes 2 goats. Father says, go get me game. Game is not goats. Game is, I don't know, deer. Probably better meat. I don't know. I never ate deer meat, but they tricked the father. He ordered one item on the menu. He ordered game, and they gave him goats. But the more important thing is that Rebecca takes the skin of the goat, puts it on Jacob's arms, and that's how he tricks his father, because his father feels him and he says, and because Esau was hairy and Yaakov and Jacob was chalak, was smooth. And the father suspects that it's not Esau. So he touches the skin, and at least in the simple interpretation of the story, he falls for it, right? So he's tricked by his father. He tricks his father with the goats, and he's fooled by the goats. Now I'm just thinking, or you can add on a deeper level, when you get into trouble here. We discussed it before. Isaac wasn't really tricked. Maybe Jacob also wasn't really tricked. Why? That's the next verse. Everyone knows the next Rashi, I think. I think we maybe mentioned it in the past. But the next verse says, and Jacob rent his garments, and he put sackcloth on his loins, and he mourned for his son for many days. No, it's not a Rashi. Oh, no. It is a Rashi. Verse 35. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to console him. But he refused to be consoled, for he said, because I will descend on account of my son as a mourner to the grave, meaning even when I die, I'm going to die mourning. And his father wept for him. We'll deal with that in a minute. Says Rashi, but he refused to be consoled. Why not? Says Rashi, no one accepts consolation for a person who is really alive, but believed to be dead. For it is decreed that a dead person shall be forgotten from the heart, but not a living person. From the Medrash Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah. So what is Rashi basically saying? Rashi is saying that nature is that if a person dies, then even though it's of course terribly painful, but over time, the mourning is diminished. That's nature. In this case, the pain was never diminished. And Rashi says, Medrash says, it's because Joseph was still alive. So it could be that consciously he's crying because he thinks that Joseph is dead. But it could be that subconsciously he realizes that it may not be the case. And that's why the mourning continues. And meaning, I'm just connecting the two stories, because when you read the story, was he really tricked? That itself is a big debate amongst the commentators. Was he really tricked? The pshat is that he was. The simple meaning was that he was. But certainly the more recent commentators, in other words, contemporary commentators in the last generation, people are starting to think about maybe he wasn't really that tricked. And Neil is right. The Medrash connects those stories. And the Medrash says, just like Jacob tricks his father Isaac, so his sons trick him. Now, but if Isaac wasn't tricked, maybe Jacob was not fully tricked. So that is for that. Fine. Then we get to a very interesting verse, and his father wept for him. Who's his father? Simple interpretation is that Jacob wept for Joseph. Father wept for him. That's a simple interpretation. The problem with that interpretation is we already said it. Didn't we just say in verse 34? Jacob rent his garments and he put sackcloth on his loins and he mourned for his son for many days. You said it in 34. And then 35 again, if you look at the subject of the verse, for all his sons and all his daughters arose to console him, and he refused to be consoled. Who? Jacob. For he said, who's he? Jacob, because I will descend and account for my son as a mourner to the grave. And his father, whose father? Jacob's father. We weren't expecting that, right? Or unless you know the Rashi. Jacob's father. Says Rashi, beautiful Rashi. Says Rashi. This refers to Isaac. He was weeping over Jacob's distress, but he did not mourn for Joseph, for he knew that he was alive. Strange Medrash. We'll deal with the Medrash in a second, but let's just deal with the grammar once more. The grammar says, the grammar verse 35 is clear. Again, the context, you would never think about that because you're not thinking about Isaac. In fact, the verse already said that Isaac died. But earlier, when it said that Isaac died, Rashi does the math and said Isaac could not have died. We just said that Isaac died because we finished talking about Isaac. Isaac is off the scene. He doesn't play any part of the story here anymore. So Isaac is really alive. So now the verse is now the Rashi says that in verse 35, everything is his sons, his daughters. The subject is Jacob. So then when the verse says, and his father wept for him, his father, it must be Jacob's father. So now the question is, why does he weep for his son and not for his grandson? Just why did he's not in mourning? He's weeping because of the pain of Jacob. But what about the grandson? So Rashi says he knew, he had intuition, Ruach HaKodesh, prophecy. He had intuition that the son, that Joseph is still alive. Okay, so tell your son that his son is still alive. Why doesn't Isaac tell Jacob that his son is still alive? So first of all, it could be, what does it mean he know? Could be he intuits, but he's not sure. He doesn't know, right? Know what he means he intuits. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, I believe the Medrash says it, that he says, if God is concealing it from him, I'm not going to tell him. Obviously, God doesn't want him to know. That's the Medrash. That's the way it's always read. People are reading this nowadays, and people are saying, what's happening is like this. So you have a whole family, and everybody's in mourning, except for one person, the grandfather. And the grandfather intuits that he's still alive. He can't tell his son that your son is still alive, because then he would say, really, where is he? Maybe he didn't know, right? Maybe he didn't know, but maybe he didn't know, but he intuited that something is wrong. That his son is alive. There's a true story. I don't have all the facts and all the dates, but there's a true story. The true story is like this, that I think it was in the early 70s, 71, I think, that Arik Sharon, later Prime Minister of Israel, at that point in general, was in New York. You know the story? Okay, but I'm going to add some part of the story that maybe you don't know. Or maybe you do know, maybe I said it. That he went to the Rebbe for an audience, and the Rebbe said, no, when are you going back to Israel? He said, tonight. The Rebbe said, don't go tonight. So I have to go, don't go tonight. He didn't go that night. That night, there was a El Al plane that was hijacked and taken to Algeria, eventually released. People think maybe they were going for Sharon, maybe not. So everybody was like, wow, the Rebbe saved Arik Sharon. Okay, fine. He was obviously very visible. Everyone knew who he would be. So even if they didn't intend it, it was just by chance. The bottom line is if he would go, he would be in great danger. At the end is nobody was hurt, etc. So that's the story that people know. I heard a story from a rabbi who spoke to another rabbi, from Rabbi Hurston in New Jersey. And he spoke to a rabbi, I forgot his name, also from New Jersey. I forget the guy's name. And he went to the Rebbe. And he went to the Rebbe and he told the Rebbe, is this true? And if it's true, if you knew that something bad is going to happen, why don't you tell everybody that something bad is going to happen? Why don't you tell Sharon that he shouldn't go? And the Rebbe got very, I don't know, like offended and very serious. And he said, of course I didn't know. Of course he didn't know that something bad is going to happen. If something bad is going to happen, then he would, call the FBI. Right? Of course he didn't know. So that's the end of that conversation. So I heard this from the rabbi when I was 13 years old in the summer camp. So the rabbi said like this, it could be, he doesn't know, but it could be the interpretation is as follows. He found in a book that says that is Ruach HaKodesh is divine spirit. And basically it's intuition, but you don't know everything. You don't know, you could see that I don't think this person should go here. Doesn't mean you know why, right? So when it says Joseph knew he was alive, when it says Isaac knew that Joseph was alive, it doesn't mean he knew exactly what happened, or he can tell, can prove to his son that Joseph is still alive. But it means he senses that there's no reason to mourn that the child is still alive. I mean, it's still to mourn. He wasn't going to see his son for 22 years, but not the death. The child is still alive. Fine. So that's the story. One way to think about it is this whole family is in pain. Whole family is in mourning because they don't see their son. And even the grandfather who knows the son is alive, the grandson is alive, doesn't know where he is, right? So there's also that pain. But it seems like Isaac's perspective could be that he knew he was alive. Isaac, amidst all the pain, Isaac senses that there's a deeper story here. And that is a very important lesson, because when a challenge arrives, you could look at it and you could see the perspective of the brothers, or the perspective of Jacob, which is basically it's a dead end. We can't turn the wheel back. Right? Either he's dead or he's sold as a slave, and if he's a slave, he can't be redeemed, whatever the case is. But then there's the perspective of Isaac, and Isaac says he sensed that there's a deeper story unfolding here, and that's why he's not mourning for Joseph. He's mourning for the pain. He's mourning that it's painful, but he's not mourning about the underlying story, because the underlying story, he realizes that there's a sub-story that's developing, and that's going to be positive. And that leads us into the next chapter, because the next chapter is a very interesting chapter, the story of Judah and Tamar, which on the surface doesn't advance the plot. It doesn't advance the plot. Not only doesn't advance the plot, it actually breaks the plot seemingly in the wrong spot. So it's, even if the story happened, but even if the story is important, it's not clear why it's important to be spoken about right now. So for that, we have to go to the Medrash, and it's going to tie into what I just said. So everything here ties in eventually, if we stick around for long enough. Okay, Had Rashi's commentary to just make it easy. Okay, so we're dealing here with Midyanim. Okay, so the Midyanim sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chamberlain, chief of the slaughterers. When you're reading the Torah, you're now in suspense. What's going to happen to Joseph? Problem with us when we read the Torah is that we already know the end of the story, so we don't have that drama. There's a great writer, Chabad Yankee Tauber, who writes a story where think it's him, maybe it was somebody else, but he's a great writer. And he writes that in when the Soviet Union fell, basically all the Chabad students went to the former Soviet Union those summers to teach Torah. So like everybody went, like, oh, my cousins went. If you were at that age, if you were between 15 and 25, you went to the Soviet Union, and they were reaching people who never had any exposure to Judaism. So this guy is describing how he's sitting in the shul on Shabbos morning, and he's saying this story of the Parsha, like we do here sometimes. And he's talking about the story of Rachel and Leah and how Lavan tricks Jacob, and he gets this whole marriage for Rachel. And then in the morning, and behold, it's Leah. And he says the words, and all of a sudden, everyone in the synagogue jumps and says, "What?" And he realized that they never heard the story. So that was a whole different experience. We're reading the Torah, we know what's going to happen, but them, he says, I never heard that. It's like a room full of adults, and they're telling the story, and they were in shock. And that's the more authentic experience, because that's what Jacob felt, right? Jacob was shaken, as were the audience. That's really, we're supposed to be shaken every year. Reminds me of the other story that people say, is that the lady comes to shul, the old woman comes to shul, and she reads the story, and she comes to the story, the sale of Joseph, and she's crying and crying. She hears the story, she's crying. The next year she comes to shul, and they read the story, and she's fine, she's happy. So the person next to her says, "Remember last year you read the story? Wasn't it so sad and so emotional? What? How come you're not crying this year?" He says, no. This year, Joseph knows the story. He should have known better. Why did he go to his brothers? Right? So that's what it does. So you're sitting at the end of your bench right now. I could tell. The cameras are off for most part, but I see you sitting on your end of your chair in suspense of what's going to happen to Joseph. Now, to figure out what's going to happen to Joseph, you're going to have to jump the entire chapter. The entire chapter 38 is a distraction. It's not. It goes away from Joseph. And that's chapter 38. And chapter 39 picks up exactly where chapter 37 concludes. So I'm skipping 38, going straight to 39. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, Pharaoh's chamberlain, chief of the slaughterers, and the Egyptian man purchased him from the Ishmaelites who brought him doan there. Again, the Ishmaelites, you see, you can't get the story straight. Midianites, Ishmaelites. Okay, so the bottom line is, we finished chapter 37. We say that Midianites sold him to Potiphar. We pick up 39, and we say, again, oh, Joseph was brought to Egypt. In middle, we go way off to Judah and Tamar. Story that lasts decades, right? Think about what has to happen. Judah has to marry. He has to have 3 sons. Those sons have to grow up. Those sons have to get married. The older one has to die. The widow of the older one has to marry the second one. The second one dies. And then Judah wants to delay the third marriage, the third son. So it's another few years until she realizes that they're not planning on doing it. And then the story concludes. She gets pregnant. She has twins, and the story concludes. These are decades. This is a story over decades. How does that break this flow of Joseph? Which is Joseph was just sold, and Potiphar bought him, and then Potiphar is going to buy him again. In other words, it's going to be reiterated. Why do you stick in chapter 38? How does Judah and Tamar land over here? Commentaries also want to understand when his story happened, because again, it's a story of decades. Which part happened right here? The simple interpretation is that the beginning happened here, but it's not so clear. The bottom line, this is a total break of the flow of the story. So what is it doing here? So there's a absolutely beautiful medrash on chapter 38. Vayhi ba'itahi, it was at that time. That's the beginning of chapter 38. Am I sharing the screen? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you want to say something? Okay. Beautiful medrash. So medrash says like this. It's going to open it up for a second. The medrash says like this: "Vayhi ba'itahi," was at that time. There's a verse that says, God says, "I know the thoughts that I am thinking," meaning I have my plans. That's the verse in the prophets. So the medrash says like this: everybody is busy in the story. The tribes are busy selling Joseph. Joseph is busy mourning that he's being sold. Jacob is mourning that Joseph died. Judah is mourning that he was mourning in general for his sins. That's why he wasn't there when they were eating lunch. Basically, everyone's doing their own thing. Says the medrash. Medrash concludes, and this is the big idea. What is God doing? God was involved in creating the light of Mashiach. How do you get to Mashiach? Well, you have Judah and Tamar. They have twins, Peretz and Zerach. Peretz is the ancestor of King David. King David is the Mashiach. For Mashiach technically means the anointed one. So David, any king of the Jewish people, was Mashiach. Saul was Mashiach, and David was Mashiach. But it could also mean the future Mashiach, descendant of David. So basically, what we're saying is like this: you're reading to the story, and you see the descent. You see the exile unfolding. The Medrash says you see the exile unfolding, but while this exile is unfolding, is a parallel story, which is really redemption unfolding. Right? So we're looking at history, we're only looking at one layer, but there are multiple layers of history, and that's what this Medrash is talking about. Ba'etei, exactly when the exile is starting, again, it will take decades till, actually more, it takes centuries till the actual exile starts from Joseph, right? The actual slavery. The going to Egypt was a few decades, but the actual slavery didn't start till about 150 years after the story. So this is the beginning of the slavery unfolding. But even before we tell that story, where the slavery is unfolding, we're saying there's a parallel story, which is redemption unfolding. Redemption in the broader sense for the Jewish people and for the rest of the world through Judah and Tamar. So why am I saying this? I'm just saying this because the Torah is telling you. So there's a few points. First point is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God always creates the medicine before the illness. The antidote is always available before the illness sets out. And you could see that patterns in history, but that's what the Medrash says. People say, I think this is true, that Columbus sailed from Europe, eventually discovering the New World, on the day that the Jews were expelled from Spain, right? So that's also takes decades, but ultimately, not decades, centuries, but ultimately that end of that era, that exile, also there's a parallel story at the same time, the same date. It's like unbelievable that it's the same date. Parallel story is the place where centuries later, it's going to be a safe haven for the Jewish people, the way Spain was at that point, right? So there are patterns. When we see the story, we just see one little story, but there are patterns of history. That's what Isaac's sense is. Isaac's sense is, of course, my son is mourning. Of course, it's painful, but he himself chooses to see the broader picture. And the broader picture is that there are parallel stories unfolding. Go ahead, Neil, please.
So there's a midrash,
Yeah.
a Jewish midrash.
A Jewish midrash? Not a Jewish midrash.
That Christopher Columbus is either Jewish or descended from Jewish people.
Or had Jews with him. That's I think pretty clear.
That he had Jews with him,
right.
That's less controversial, but that he was Jewish himself. And that he moved the date of the departure to be Tisha B'Av because he did it in connection with this.
Interesting.
He actually had a strong feeling.
Interesting.
Prophecy.
Right. Yeah. So if it was conscious or subconscious, I don't mind. I don't mind either way.
And it's also that when he died, the markings on his gravestone were the way Jewish people did it, who wanted to hide the fact they were Jewish.
When they wanted to hide.
So when he died, his gravestone couldn't say, Moshe ben Nachman.
Yeah, of course.
It had to say.
I'm part of my ignorance. Do we know where he's buried? Is he in Europe?
Midrash.
But do we know where he's buried? Do we know? Is in Europe? Is in the New World? Do we know? I don't know. We'll Google it later.
Okay, so
we have Bob. So maybe got Bob.
He was in the New World.
Yeah.
He was arrested and put back in the Old World.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I'm pretty sure he died in Europe.
Okay, go ahead, Bob. Please give us some insights.
I can't weigh in on the final decision of that question, but I do have an observation. For many of you who are not a lucky participant in our Friday sessions, we talk about unity, and sometimes you have to digress and kind of break up the unity to get reunited.
Right.
And this seems to be a very salient example of that, in that, the Jewish people were okay and we were united. You might ask, Isaac, in his view of all this, saw the descent to disunity and exile and slavery, but saw as you said, the elements of the rehealing and the reunification right in front of him. So it's you might say, what is the exercise for? It's to make the Jewish people a greater people, the children of Israel, and the exile had a purpose and a greater purpose than just a punishment.
Right. No, clearly, clearly, I think that's correct. But just to talk about the possible purpose could be, and both are true, I think. Possible purpose is for the Jewish people themselves, the unity of the family themselves, the Jewish people overcoming the challenge and becoming stronger and greater, more committed to kindness, etc. Right? You see this all over the Torah. The Torah keeps it reiterating in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy that you know what it means to be the ger, to be the foreigner, because you were gerim, you were foreigners in Egypt. In other words, that experience makes us better people. But it could also be that Joseph represents the notion that you want to impact the world, right? Redemption for the world. So Joseph is going to Egypt, affecting its economy, ultimately spiritually laying roots for the influencing the rest of the world. So that can also be part of the story that we don't always see. And certainly, if you want to talk about that, when Medrash says that everyone's busy with whatever they're busy with, and God is busy preparing the light of Mashiach through Peretz, David's ancestor. So if Mashiach means the ultimate redemption, then certainly that has the element of correcting the world, not just the Jewish people. So, but I agree. There's always going to be a break. And this is a very important point in the Kabbalah, but you also see it in the Talmud. You see it in the Talmud, it emphasizes this, that it's in the Torah, and you also see it in Jewish practice, that the night always comes before the day, right? By Erev Vayivoker, first evening, then morning. Now, symbolically, it means before there's going to be a new stage of growth, there has to be darkness before that. And the question is, how come? So there are many interpretations. But you basically have to break the old model to grow to new potential, because otherwise you're trapped with the successes of the old model. So for exponential growth, you have to sort of break the old, because the old is really, any level of success is really also a trap. And the old model is a trap to become the new potential. And there's all kinds of examples in nature. Like the example that Hasidic works love to bring is the example of a seed. You have a perfectly good seed, you can eat it, you can enjoy it, you can grind it, you can do all kinds of things. You put it into the earth and it can produce a tree. Completely different ballgame. To create that tree, it has to germinate, it has to rot, it has to lose its old shell. And in the meantime, between the existence, the language of the Kabbalah, before existence and existence, in between existence and existence, you have nothingness, right? Because you're morphing, you're changing from the old existence, and at that point, it just seems destruction. Why take a perfectly good seed and put it in the earth where it's going to rot, right? Oh, because then that's just the old, and then something new will come about. So that is the model of the world. That's the way the world works, and it's built into our culture, where we start the day, the 24-hour period, we start the night before the day, Vayi-Erev Vayi-Voker. That's the model. You move from darkness to light, and that darkness is critical to the creative process. And artists understand this, that you have to have the frustration and the creative block. So I don't know if they understand that they have to have it. They understand that they have it. You go to the libraries, all the arts, when it comes to the art sections, everyone wants to know, how do I overcome creative block? And they give you all kinds of techniques. You eat your chocolate at 10 o'clock and have your coffee at 12 and go on a walk and look at the smell of the flower. Everybody has got their ritual to overcome creative block. Kabbalah says you don't want to overcome it. You have to go through it. The frustration and the anguish of the artist is going to produce a better product. You would never come to the greater work of art if not for the frustration. Frustration basically means it's humility, it's you're crushed. And that is what allows your deeper potential to come out to the fore. And that's true with the individual person, and it's also true in history. So it's painful, but it's necessary for growth. So every time I see all the ideas how to overcome creative block, I'm like, okay, Kabbalistically, you don't want to overcome it. You have to push through it, but it's a critical part in the creative process. Chachma, the lightning of the idea, a new idea usually comes when there's frustration, when a person is shattered, person understands the problems of the old model, doesn't walk around when I'm so perfectly satisfied and content and say, I know everything there is to know about the subject. It's not when you get the breakthrough. You get the breakthrough and you know everything there is to know about the subject, and you sense and you're in pain that you have a problem and you have to overcome. And that problem, the more painful that problem is, the more potential you have to get to the infinity within your soul.
And the juxtaposition of these two stories is a template that will be used over and over again to underscore that very point.
I think so. But I think that the idea of parallel stories, there's the parallel story, the story that I see. I see destruction. I see exile. I see descent, right? And it's true. And everybody's crying in that medrash. Jacob is crying, the brothers are crying, Joseph's crying, everybody's crying. What's Hashem doing? Hashem is creating the light of Mashiach. Okay, it may take a few hundred years or a few thousand years, depending on who the Mashiach is. In other words, referring to David or referring to the ultimate Mashiach. But so we don't always see the trends. We don't always see the turn. But we have to always understand that there is more to the story unfolding than we can see. And that's the message of breaking up the story in exactly this way.
This is also where biblical criticism says there's multiple authors, right?
Of course. I mean, all the breaks, all the inconsistencies, they don't realize. The funniest thing about biblical criticism is they come up with these questions and they think they came up with the questions. Meanwhile, we've been addressing the questions for written at least 2,000 years, orally probably 3,000 years, 300 years. So it's like you didn't discover America when you say, oh, I see there's a problem here. Here's an Hashem and here's Elohim. Yes, look at the first Rashi in the Torah, who quotes the Medrash, which was recorded 1,800 years ago, and we've been talking about this for a long time. So you can offer your other, if you want to offer a different interpretation, you can offer a different interpretation, but don't present yourself as you found the discrepancy that nobody knew of. That's just ridiculous. Yeah, but built into the story, that's the way a text can convey deeper layers of plot by using these inconsistencies to invite inquiry.
And what do you make of the fact that the fourth word is Vayered?
So there's descent. Vayered, so Judah descends. Now, the term Vayered is also talking about Joseph. I mean, the same thing right after chapter 38. So chapter 38 says it was at that time that Judah went down. But Vayered, he went down, but Vayered could also mean descent. And then if you look at chapter 39, it's this, when we go back to Joseph's story, we have Judah descending, and then we have Joseph descending. The only difference is that Joseph is passive. Joseph is brought down. Joseph had been brought down, but in the Hebrew, it's the same word. Second word of chapter 39, Yosef Hurad. He was brought down. It's Nifal. He was acted upon, but he was brought down. So there's descent for Joseph. There's also descent for Judah. Judah was involved in the sale. So there's descent. Literally, he goes down to a place wherever he went to live, but it's also descent that Rashi says the brothers demoted him from his greatness because they saw about the great pain the father was in. So that's why Judah doesn't live with his family. He goes away from his family. He goes to a place called, he distances himself from his family, marries a daughter of a Canaanite. Rashi tries to say it's not really a Canaanite in biblical Hebrew, in the Torah, in the prophets. Canaani could be the person of the member of the nation of Canaan, but Canaani, because they were merchants, Canaani can also be a merchant, right? So the Rashi says that he went down and he met a merchant man, right? He married a daughter of a merchant man, because the problem is to marry a Canaanite is would be strange because the patriarchs did not want to marry Canaanite girls. So it's a big debate if the tribes actually marry Canaanites or not. But the bottom line is Rashi addresses your idea and says, Vayered Yehuda, Judah descends. And he's descended, he's demoted from his greatness because he was involved in the sale of Joseph. Now, Joseph also descends, and Judah descends, everyone descends. What we have to look for is where's the turning point?
Question on grammar. Is the opposite of Vayered is Vayigash?
No, Vayigash is approach. La'alot, Aliyah is the opposite of Yerida.
But when it says in the Torah later on,
Vayigash approaches, doesn't mean go up.
Doesn't it mean something more lofty? So this is Vayigash Alav Yehuda when he goes to defend.
Yeah, so it could be a formal meeting, but like Geshet is to approach. So I don't know if it's directly the antithesis of Vayered, right? There's an interesting word in Hebrew. You always have words that two opposite meanings in the same word. We'll conclude with this idea because it's 10:30. It's a fascinating concept in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, that the same root could mean the two opposites. In English, you would do it by adding a prefix, by adding the un, right? So you could say believable, unbelievable, faithful, unfaithful, right? You can do it to everything by adding the prefix, and the prefix switches the word. In biblical Hebrew, you don't need a prefix. The same word has opposite terms. So, for example, shoresh could mean root and uproot. Same word without adding the prefix. One example is Yerida. Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim. Joseph was descended to Egypt. Chapter 39. In biblical Hebrew, it's all over the Bible. It's even in Genesis. When God tells man to rule over the world, rule the animals, uridu b'chayat haaretz, rule over the animals. So, lirdot, laredet, same word, ruler, ruling, descend and rule, which is opposites. So we'll talk about the opposite issue in a second, but in the context, and not today, but in the context of Joseph, you can read it, Joseph descends to Egypt, or you can read it, Joseph ruled Egypt. Which one is right? They're both right over time. So Joseph rules Egypt, right? So
Pharaoh rules Egypt.
Pharaoh's sitting in his palace, has no interest in what's going on in the country, he just wants to have fun. Pharaoh doesn't rule Egypt. Pharaoh gives him the keys. Pharaoh doesn't rule Egypt. Joseph rules Egypt. He said, without you, no one's going to lift a finger in the land of Egypt. That's what Pharaoh tells Joseph. So Joseph rules Egypt. So Joseph descends, and the Medrash says, Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim, the Medrash says, Kivshon, he oppressed, he ruled over them. So the verse says he was descent, and at that point it's descent. But the Medrash has the advantage of knowing the end of the story. And if you have the bird's eye view, you realize that what you thought is a descent is really a step to leadership. And that's all alluded to in that word, Yosef Hurad. Yosef was descended. A lot more to say. Unfortunately, it's 10:32 and there's a lot to do today. So thank you all for joining and have a wonderful day. And we should meet each other in good health.
Yashikov, Rabbi.
Yashikayach. Thank you.
So when